Again, thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled A Revolutionary History of the Middle East. Our leader for this session is Naghmeh Sohrabi, the Charles Corky Goodman Professor of Middle East History at Brandeis University. Naghmeh Sohrabi is the Charles Corky Goodman Professor of Middle East History and the Director for research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies. She is the author of the book Taken from Wonder: 19th Century Travel Accounts from Iran to Europe, Oxford University Press 2012, and numerous articles on Iranian history, politics, and culture. She is the 2014-2015 recipient of the Andrew W. Mellon New Directions Fellowship, and in 2017-2018, a co-recipient of a Mellon-Sawyer Seminar Fellowship in Comparative Revolutions. In 2015, she was awarded the Bernstein Faculty Fellowship, and in 2019, the Michael L. Walzer Award for Teaching Excellence at Brandeis. She is currently writing her second book on the experience of the 1979 revolution in Iran, for which she also received an ACLS Fellowship in 2020, and the Berlin Prize for American Academy in Berlin in spring 2021. Professor Sohrabi is a member of the International Advisory Board, Oriental Institute, Czech Academy of Science, member of Advisory Board, Women's World, and Qajar, Iran, a digital archive, and was the president of the Association for Iranian Studies from 2021 to 2022. She is also the co-host and co-editor of Counter Argument, a Middle East podcast, and writes a Substack on Iran titled These Are the True Things. To our network of teachers, both national and international, and without further ado, I present to you all Dr. Naghmeh Sohrabi. We are honored to have you tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mike, and hello to everybody. I'm very excited to go on this multi-century long journey with you all. But before we do, I really want to thank the National Humanities Center, particularly Mike and Raven Ferguson, who just made it possible for me to be a voice on your computer today. And a special thanks, of course, to Primary Source, with whom I've been working for decades at this point. And a special thanks to Dan Osborne, whom Mike mentioned, but I want to mention Dan to say, may we all be so lucky to have such wonderful former students. And it's just so lovely to see all that he is doing. And lastly, a shout out to all you teachers. It's just an honor to be in conversation with you, but particularly because I noticed there are so many of you from LAUSD. I'm a Taft High School graduate, and it's just lovely to keep seeing that word LAUSD keep popping up in the chat box. So now I want to start the talk. Well, I thought I would start from a wise source of information, which is ChatGPT, and also the fact that I know all of us educators have ChatGPT on the mind and have had it for quite a while now. So I asked ChatGPT, give me a paragraph about modern Middle East history and revolutions. And ChatGPT told me the Middle East has been a region of significant political upheaval throughout history, with revolutions and uprisings occurring frequently over the centuries. These movements have been motivated by a variety of factors, including grievances against authoritarian rulers, economic inequality, and calls for greater political representation and freedom. So far, so good. In recent times, the Arab Spring of 2011 brought a wave of popular uprisings across the region, leading to the overthrow of several long-standing dictators and sparking hope for democratic reform. However, the aftermath of these revolutions has been complex and often violent, with ongoing conflicts and political instability in many countries. Understanding the history of revolutions in the Middle East is crucial for comprehending the region's contemporary political landscape. Now, I've been thinking about this ever since I asked AI to give me an answer, or rather to do my work for me. Let's just be honest about this. And I've been thinking about it a lot for a number of reasons. What's really been bothering me is that I couldn't put a finger on, well, what is wrong with this paragraph? Because on the surface, nothing is wrong. Every sentence is technically correct. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something is missing. The explanation is a bit off. And I realized that the answer of why it's wrong in some ways doesn't have anything to do with the fact that this is an AI, but rather where a program like this gets its answers. As we all know, the answers it gives to our questions is that it calls what is out there already. So in many ways, this paragraph is a reflection of our general common understandings of why revolutions are important to the modern Middle East and how this importance kind of plays itself out. And as I thought about this more, I realized that the problem with not just AI, but with our, and by our, I mean primarily, I'm talking about my own place, which is American common understanding, is that we often frame 20th and 21st century history of the Middle East in a tragic way. There's always a tragic framing of it. It's one that reinforces the idea of instability, of chaos, and failure of reforms in the region. Now, this framing is not necessarily always wrong, but it is definitely not always the only way to understand the region. And the framing also connects with another very common question. It was much more common in the 1990s, which is the other part of the slide, this idea of what went wrong. The oft-repeated idea that things are bad in the region, and then the explanations are, well, what went wrong? And the answer is, oh, it's because of their culture, it's because of their religion, or it's because of colonialism, or it's because of Orientalism, or it's because of neoliberalism, and it all goes on. And again, as we will see, this doesn't mean that things have not gone wrong, merely that there are other questions that we can and we should ask of the modern Middle East. And some of these questions are ways to think about the idea of what people are aspiring for, what they are hoping, and how this hopes and dreams and inspirations actually live past political and social moments and events that we call revolutions, and we're going to get into what we mean by that in a second. And I just want to say that this webinar is based on a class that I'm teaching this semester. So before I move forward, I want to thank actually all 15 of my students. As all of us teachers know, as much as we teach them, they also enrich our thinking about the world. And my students have very much enriched my thinking about revolutions. And in that class, one of the things we've done, and we're going to do it again today, is that the course takes revolutions and revolutionary moments as seriously as the people who experience them. Now, the question again on our mind is, what would the history of the modern Middle East look like if our framing and organizing principle didn't look at just rise and falls of empires, at nationalism, as questions of sectarianism, but revolutionary movements and revolutionary demands that demand basically a desire for change? Now, a revolutionary history of the modern Middle East lets us remember that nothing is preordained. And that's one of the first principles that I want you guys to all think about. It makes us remember that people continuously did and do dream of a better or a different life. And more importantly, in a time like ours, where a click or a like or a retweet often counts as activism, people who go out into the street often make sacrifices for these lives and for these dreams. And that the value of these sacrifices, and I think this is probably a better slide to be talking about this, does not lie exclusively in macro changes such as democratic systems, though those are of course of great value. And lastly, this way of thinking that my class and I have been doing, and I hope you will do with me, this type of historical thinking allows us to foreground ideas It allows us to think about movements of people and thought, and allows us to focus on historical process versus just merely eventful outcomes. And I can delve into this more when we have questions, or if you want to ask questions more about what that would mean actually in a practical way. Okay, so now let's go back to this slide, which is, what are revolutions? And you should be by now really thinking about that and wondering, what do I mean by it? Are revolutions just people coming out and shouting things? Revolutions, as you can tell both from the slide but from our everyday life, has an amorphous meaning in our popular culture. From Bernie Sanders to Syria, from the pandemic to recent protests in Iran, we use the word revolution to underline, at the very least, two things. We underline some kind of change or potential for change, and we talk about something significant. And there's a common factor often in there, which is that it involves people. Now, social scientists in particular have tried and continue to try to define revolutions in very specific and more specific terms. And out of that has come, many, many decades of theorizing and thinking about revolutions. And often social scientists in particular talk about these in terms of waves of theories of revolution. And we're not going to get into these waves today, but I'm happy to send you reading material if you were interested in it. But each wave that they talk about contains indices to make something like a revolution, which in my understanding of it is vast, it's messy, and it's contingent, fit into categories of thought. And the end goal, I think, is very important for all of us, the end goal of this categorization that social scientists do, for allowing us to retroactively understand what we're looking at. And here I have just one of the most often quoted definitions of a social revolution, which is by the sociologist Theda Skocpol. There's my students read actually a whole piece about what Theda Skocpol said about the Iranian Revolution. But this this quote, you'll see it a lot if you look into it, which is that social revolutions, she defines them as rapid, basic transformation of a society's state and class structures, accompanied and in part carried through by class-based revolts from below. Now, various sociologists have pointed out that definition doesn't really encompass everything. And so one of my students' favorite theoreticians about revolutions is the political scientist Eric Selbin, and they really like him primarily because he talks about the importance of narrative and story and thinking about these terms. And he talks about revolution as, quote, conscious effort by a broad-based, popularly mobilized group of actors, formal or informal, to profoundly transform the social, political, and economic institutions which dominate their lives. The goal is the fundamental transformation of the material and ideological conditions of their everyday lives. This reflects a process of origination and subsequent struggle, and an outcome, the effort, fundamental transformation. When both elements are realized, we are more likely to consider them, quote, great or, quote, social revolutions. Lesser instances are often labeled political revolutions, rebellions, revolts, resistance, or other types of political action. But the question we ask in our class, and I want to ask you, is there a point in defining revolutions? And I obviously really like this New Yorker cartoon, which reimagines fairy tales through a revolutionary framework, and I'll just let you look at it as I talk. And what I'm going to do here today is I'm going to try to do what I try to do with my class, which is that one thing we're not going to do here today is to go down the rabbit hole of definitions. And I already mentioned some of the reasons why, and I can talk about it more in the Q&A. I'll ask you for the next however many minutes we're together, rather, to take events, to take historical moments that were called or experienced as revolutions by the participants as revolutions themselves, and ask, What can we understand about the Middle East, about revolutions, and also historical memory if we take these experiences and these feelings of the participants as seriously as they took them? And I'm just going to give you an example. I don't know how well you can see this, but I did. This is something that I did for the class, and I think it's very illuminative of why we're going to look at it from the perspective of the participants versus social scientist examples and definitions of revolution. So, in one of these things, between 1965 and 1975, there was a revolution in a province of Oman called Dhofar. It's a very fascinating revolution, but we're not going to talk about that at this moment. Now, if in English you try to Google the Dhofar Revolution, you get what you see on the left side of my screen. Google actually won't even say, do you also mean the Dhofar Rebellion? You can only understand that as a rebellion. Now, if you do the same Google search in Arabic and you put in the Arabic equivalent of the Dhofar Revolution, what you get is a lot of material in Arabic, but again, you see that the English reverts back to rebellion. And that gap of naming and experiencing, between naming and experiencing, is the gap in which we talk in my class and today about the century of revolutions in the Middle East and the significance of it. So again, in that framework, taking this idea that I just presented, in the course of 14 weeks, we look at 5 revolutionary periods that I have come to believe that have, and other scholars that have defined the modern Middle East. So now I'm just going to give you a little bit of a warning, which is that we are going to go through these 5 moments of revolutionary periods rather quickly, but do not worry because we're going to then double back. The whole goal of this is I want to give you just a general broad sense of how vast this topic is and the multiplicity of geographies and ideas that we're talking about. And then we're going to go back and look at some things in greater detail. Now, these are 2 maps. The left one is obviously of the Ottoman Empire, which encompass quite a bit of what we call the Arab world today. And on the right-hand side, you see a map of where we are today. So when we talk about this century, or bringing it to today's century and a quarter, we're also talking about a broader political transformation of the region from a system of empires to ascension of nation states. And so unsurprisingly, the first period is a period of constitutional revolutions of the turn of the 20th century, particularly that of the Young Turks in the Ottoman Empire, which happened in 1908, and in Iran, and a little bit later you have it in Egypt. These are often, with the exception of Egypt, but even that you can sort of smush it in, pre-World War I constitutional revolutions. The people who were the demands that they were making was that they opposed autocratic personalist rule. They asked for reforms that had revolutionary potential, and always included some kind of opening up of space for women and often an expansion of gender roles. They were often driven by elites, and particularly the intelligentsia, and there was always an international factor that went into it. And those of you who are teachers of history of other parts of the world know we can look to what was happening in Ireland, what was happening in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, in Portugal, and these were all in Armenia, and these were all connected to each other through various networks of people and again and ideas, and often they quote ended through some kind of coup or counter action by conservative forces. But what's really interesting about them that none of these constitutional revolutions have been renamed the way in which later 20th century revolutions have been renamed as something else, as we'll see in a second. Now, the second revolutionary period that we look at is what I'm calling the communist, socialist, anti-imperial revolutionary groups and movements in the interwar period. And if you looked at the reading one of the readings that I suggested you read, and I'm not going to go into it now, is this reading by Jens Hansen, which does a really nice job of kind of laying out all of these often small or medium-sized, some of them big, communist and socialist groups. I created some kind of like a story map for the class, and I couldn't play it here because I didn't know if we had animation. But this is just a freeze frame of it to just give you guys a sense of how many different political groups we had. They were who self-identified as either socialists or communists in the interwar period. A little bit before that, we started in 1910. We end a little bit later. But if you look at the map, there are these clusters of activities in various parts of the region during that time. Now, independence in colonial and mandate states, and mandates were a new type of colonial control. As you know, it came out of World War I and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, but often independence in that period, so between World War I and World War II in the region, came about through revolts that were led by nationalist elites and often sometimes supported by these left-leaning groups. And these revolts and independence happens around the time of World War II, eventually, as you can see. And it's this struggle that we have in the interwar period is an important factor in the development of the next revolutionary period that we're going to look at, which is decolonization. And I will say that this slide is there because my students really emphasized, and I told you that I'm talking to you all, that I need to tell you this in order for the next phase to make sense to you, which is the phase, it's one of the most important periods for the topic that we're looking at, which is the decolonization era. Now, decolonization is one of those words that has a lot of definitions, and in some ways, it has an easy definition, right? It's decolonizing, uncolonizing. But of course, it gets much more complicated once we get past the idea of definitions and get into nitty-gritty descriptions of it. The one that I have picked for you comes from an Algerian philosopher, so I wanted to pick a definition that is created within the decolonizing world, and it's an exit from the colonial situation with all of its related racial, psychological, social, political, and economic implications. And already you begin to see why is it that this particular period was rife with so many revolutionary movements and revolutions themselves. And this is just some sense of the kinds of events that we're talking about. We're talking about a coup revolution that I will talk about in more detail very soon. In Iran, you have the nationalization of oil, and then the 1953 coup, U.S.-led coup, which was the first time that the U.S. actually led this kind of coup. It did a lot more in later years, but 53 is actually the first time that this happened. You have the Suez Crisis in 56. You have another coup that overthrows the monarchy and establishes Iraq as a republic in 58, and so on and so forth. Now, the next period that we look at is what I'm just calling late 20th century Marxist tinge revolution. And you'll be surprised, of course, to see that the Iranian Revolution, which we think of as an Islamic revolution, as being in that category. Now, 1979 was a very big year for revolutions, so like straight up revolutions. So you have Iran, of course, you have Grenada, and you have Nicaragua as the three big global South revolutions of 1979. Now, when we talk about these late 20th century revolutions, I want to go back to the idea of Dhofar in Oman, which I talked about a little earlier. We often miss it. It's a revolution, but it's a revolution that in many ways embodied its time. It was Marxist. It had gender and racial egalitarian goals. It included armed struggle, and it became a global revolutionary site that included Cuba, Vietnam, Palestinians, Iranians, and the British. And that happened between 1965 and 1975, and then the Iranian Revolution 79. And the reason I put them together is not because there's so many ideas, but because actually Oman and Iran become intertwined as a result of the Monsoon Revolution. The Iranian monarchy sends troops to support the Sultan in 1971, 1972 to Oman. And for the Iranian revolutionaries who were already active, this just becomes another revolutionary node. And then the Marxists and the Marxist Islamists send people into Dhofar to fight this revolution. So it becomes almost a proxy revolution for 1979. And then last but not least, what we talk about in my class is the revolutions of the Arab Spring in 2011 and beyond. These were often dubbed as Arab Winters, and their aftermath renamed as uprisings. And in the Syrian case, a true global tragedy with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands killed, only for the Bashar regime to remain until today. And that is basically how we end the class. So as I mentioned to you, I realize I can't cover all of this in the time that we have. So I asked my students, what should I talk to you about and why? And so these are the 4 moments that the majority of them recommended. They wanted me to talk to you about the 1952 revolution in Egypt because they said it may not be necessarily a straight up revolution, but it was an important inflection point in Middle East history. They all said that I should talk to you about Algeria because it was truly a global revolution. And one of them actually pointed out because it would be a different type of revolution because the power that people were fighting against was France and not US, which is what we really think about often when we think about the Middle East and US in the latter part of the 20th century. We're going to talk about the 1979 revolution because as one of them said to me, Professor, you should do something that makes you happy. They are very kind students. And they all emphasized that I should at least mention the Arab revolutions, the Arab Spring revolutions, because they said maybe we're all presentists and that's okay. And also because they said there are a lot of misconceptions about it today. Let me pause for a second and see if there are any questions at this point. If not, we're going to delve into a number of revolutions.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. And also shout out to your students for providing those recommendations as well. So let them know that we're appreciative and we thank them for that.
Will do.
We have a single question. I actually have a question from Dan Osborne. Thank you so much. And his question is he mentions that in an early slide, you included an image of a Bernard Lewis text in order to critique a certain type of question asked and frame imposed upon the Middle East, which revolves around the assertion that something, quote unquote, something went wrong. The critique of Lewis' narrative is in part based on the realization that it's deeply problematic to essentialize the Middle East. So Dan's question is, in the context of understanding 20th century revolutions in the Middle East, how can we understand the Middle East revolutions as occurring within a period of global revolutions? Can situating Middle East revolutions in a global context, or in doing so, can we avoid re-essentializing the Middle East? Yet, is something lost or obscured when studying the region as an extension of global patterns?
Just so that everybody knows, Dan had threatened to ask hard questions. So I'm really glad he follows through on his threat. This is a really big question, as he knows, and I think as the audience, as everybody else can tell also. I think I'll talk about these issues maybe a bit more once we get into the nitty-gritty of the revolutions. But let me say just a general thing that you are absolutely correct that talking about revolutions in a global context, one of the things it does is that it does de-essentialize it, as if revolutions happen because this place is unstable, because it doesn't have democracy, whatever the essential ideas, or because it's an Islamic area. But also it's important to talk about revolutions in a global context because that is actually what happened with them. And so in that sense, it both serves a broader purpose, but it actually is a much more of a reflection of reality than thinking about revolutions as these closed off, non-porous events. And unfortunately, I don't have this slide, or I would show it to you. I was initially going to show you this slide from a fantastic book by Huri Berberian called Roving Revolutionaries, which is about these turn of the century constitutional revolutions and how a series of Armenian revolutionaries acted as these connectors between the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and the Young Turk Revolution around the turn, as I said, between 1905, let's say, and 1909 and 1907. And she has this beautiful map of one of these revolutionaries, basically his travels. And it's incredible. He traveled, and remember, he's not traveling by plane, so he traveled like from Tbilisi to Stockholm. He went all over the region. And so when we think about revolutions, we have to, by nature, think about them as these global events. It's a really good question, Dan, as to what is then lost when we just take a global lens, which is why I think increasingly scholars who are working on revolutions, and here I'm going to borrow a term from one of my favorite scholars, which is this political scientist at NYU called Aran Keshavarzian, which is to think about geography in scales, right? And he talks about it particularly in the context of the Iranian Revolution. He edited this book called Global 1979. And what that means is to think about the local and the regional and the global as these different scales, as opposed to these different just carved out geographies. And when you do that, then it becomes possible to think more about not, oh, what is local, what is global, but to think about how the local is informed by the global and vice versa. That was a much more general answer to your very large question, but let's leave it there and come back to it perhaps when we come closer to more 20th century, more connected revolutions.
Good deal. Thank you. I look forward to it. That's the only question we have for now. Thank you.
I have that power on people. I just make them not want to ask me any more questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So, per the recommendations of my students, we're going to start with Egypt in 1952. Now, this photo that you see is actually a photo of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a second, that is being held by a protester in 2011. And the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 was, as I mentioned, a coup, but it is constantly and is always seen, well, not always, but it is celebrated often as a revolution by the Egyptians inside. And in some ways, as this picture shows, it could be seen as a root of a revolution, that revolution being 2011. This is, again, really complicated, but I'm just going to really breeze through it, and please feel free to ask any questions. This is Gamal Abdel Nasser, as you can see. What happened in Egypt in 1952, which was that a number of a secret society, they called themselves free officers. They were all officers in the army. They had fought in 1948 when in the aftermath of Israel's declaration of independence. And they had come to believe, and Egypt at this time has a strong British presence. It's not fully independent of the Brits. And they had come to the understanding that the failure of 1948, and in general the problems of Egypt, lied basically in the failures of the monarchy. And so they, through a complicated process, overthrow the monarch in 1952. Now, initially, Gamal Abdel Nasser is not the president. He becomes a president in 1956, and shortly afterwards, he nationalizes the Suez Canal. And this is a picture from that nationalization of Suez. As a result of that, there is what's called the tripartite aggression, which is France, Britain, and Israel attack Egypt, and long story short, they don't win. And that propels Nasser past being just a hero of the Egyptians into being a leader of the Arab world. He was lionized, he was celebrated throughout the Arab world. Now, the question is, why would a coup be called a revolution, right? And the answer lies in the other part of this slide, which is that the three officers had a 6-point plan, but Gamal Abdel Nasser really carried out big parts of this plan, which included agrarian reform, industrialization, massive expansion of the education, and connected to that of the bureaucracy. And internationally, he became one of the leaders of the non-alliance movement that was emerging in the global south. And you can see pictures of him, for example, in the Bandung conference. He was one of the leaders of that. And going back to this slide for a second, he also is the reason for the creation of the United Arab Republic, which is up here. It's the upper slide you can see, which basically would have made a non-contiguous union of Egypt and Syria, but was seen to be the first step towards this dream of a pan-Arab nation that many held, and he was seen very much as the leader of the pan-Arabism at the time. It's important, of course, to mention that this is the thing that he actually accomplished, but he also, there was a massive crackdown of communists and a massive crackdown on Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood in 1954 and 1965. His presidency does, and of course there's a Six-Day War in 1967. There's a very complicated story about that. Nasser himself wrote a book. He called what happened in 52 a revolution. He wrote a book in 1954 called Philosophy of the Revolution. There he portrayed the 1952 coup as the culmination of Egypt's long fight for independence. And he writes, the revolution of July 23rd is the realization of a hope that the people of Egypt in modern times have aspired to since they began to think of governing themselves and since they decided to be the masters of their faith. What he is mentioning here, what he has in mind, is something, and every Egyptian who would read that and hear that would know that what he is talking about, of course, is Colonel Arabi's nationalist movement in the 19th century, and this call that it's associated with, which is the call of Egypt for the Egyptians, and of course the massive crushing of this nationalist movement when the Brits invaded in 1882 under the guise that it's a debt collection that was connected to the Suez Canal. Now, Nasser served as an inspiration, as I mentioned, and as a hero for many who engaged in struggles against colonial powers in the post-World War II era. And Algerians who had been colonized by the French since 1830 were no exception to this rule. And you can see here in the top photo, I don't know if you can see that, but this is Nasser walking with Ben Bella, who is also here, sitting here talking to Castro, who was one of the leaders of the Algerian revolution and call for independence. Now, much like the 1952 coup, we now talk about what was called the Algerian Revolution as the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. With the creation of the National Liberation Front, and that is the group that Ben Bella created and was a part of, it's known as FLN because of the French title, but National Liberation Front is the translation. It was created in 1954, and with that, the century-long Algerian struggle against France entered a new stage. The FLN fed off a new global atmosphere of decolonial struggle, and this connects itself to actually Dan's question, and a whole global background for revolutionary activities. And in turn, when Algeria gained its independence in 1962, it became, with my colleague Jeffrey Burns and others called the Mecca of Revolution. That's the title of Jeffrey's book. And they became basically the Mecca of revolution for many subsequent revolutionary groups, such as the Black Panthers, which you can see in this other photo that I have on this slide. Again, there's so much to say about Algeria. I'm sure you've all seen or heard about the Battle of Algiers. I wish we could talk about it in more detail. But it's important to just say that, like many other revolutions before it, the FLN did what others before it could not do. This is why they won. They galvanized the population around a very simple, in some ways, cause, even though it was not simple to carry out, which was the French have to be out. And they did that through both persuasion and sometimes through force. And they basically closed off some of the other ideas that had existed at the time, which is let's reform, as opposed to let's have a revolution and throw out the French colonizers. And so, in many ways, it became a binary choice. You were either with the FLN and you were not, or you were with the colonizers. And that, in some ways, is a simple secret to the success of the FLN. That's putting it very, very simplistically. Now, what is not simplistic, of course, is the role of violence with which the Algerian Revolution both experienced and also basically it just experienced it, but many people have talked about it ever since. And of course, the theorization of revolution that came out of it. And the most famous figure for that, of course, is Frantz Fanon, who is the main theorizer of revolutions and, of course, of anti-colonial violence. And he wrote very famously, each individual forms a violent link in the great chain, a part of the great organism of violence which has surged upward in reaction to the settlers' violence in the beginning. And he also said, and this is very quoted often, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. As you can see here, in 1962, Charles de Gaulle announces Algerian independence. There's a referendum in Algeria, and that's when it's then announced in Algeria. And Ben Bella, who, as I mentioned, was one of the founders of the FLN, is president until 1965, when he is overthrown by a coup led by comrade Boumediene. Going back to the issue of revolutionary violence, it's important to say that while we don't have a set number of the fatalities that happened during the Algerian Revolution, it was very, very high. The majority of the casualties actually was borne by the Algerian civilians and the populations itself. And as I mentioned, I want to return to it again, is that Algeria refashioned itself in the aftermath of its revolution into a hub of post-colonial revolutionary activities. And if you are interested in its connection to the Black Panthers, I'm happy to talk about it later. So the revolution of 1979 is one that everyone here has definitely heard of and most likely knows a thing or two about. And of all the revolutions that I've mentioned, it's the one that's most entwined with the American imagination for a whole number of reasons, not the least of which is the 444 days of the hostage crisis that occurred in its aftermath. What is the Iranian Revolution about? Again, we're going to look at debates about it, but Michael J. Fisher has written that the causes of a revolution and its timing were economic and political, but the form of the revolution and its pacing owed much to the tradition of a religious protest. And this becomes important because while the Iranian Revolution, it's never been questioned. People haven't renamed it a rebellion or an uprising. It's always remained the word revolution around it. What has come before the word revolution keeps changing. So some people call it an Islamic revolution. Some people call it the 1978 revolution. There's a whole number of debates around the nature of the revolution itself. In a very basic form, what was the revolution? It was, again, an overthrow of the monarchy by masses and masses of people. And I teach, again, a whole semester on this, so it's going to be very hard to summarize it, but I want to focus on how this revolution, some of the characteristics of the opposition group in the 60s and 70s, because I think it's a lot more multifaceted than we often assume, and it has a lot of surprises and unexpected aspects to it, not the least of which, and I hope you can see this on your screens at home, is a picture of this veiled woman holding a flower. But if you look in her hands, She's holding a pamphlet on Che Guevara's writings on armed struggle. Like many, many revolutions of its time and of its kind, the 1979 revolution, the people who went out into streets, especially in the earlier period, were mostly young. There were many university students. Many of them were leftist inclined, but that does not mean they were communists. In fact, they were not. Some of them were communists, but when I say leftist inclined, that's not what I mean. There was underground groups, there were diaspora groups, mosques were involved, bazaars were involved, universities, seminaries. So it was all encompassing in terms of space. The quote that I started with, which was Michael Fisher's quote, it points out to an important part of this revolution, is that both the secular and the religious opposition groups, they adopted Shi'i ritual symbols. What does that mean? It means most famously, and this is something that if you read even one or two books about the Iranian Revolution, you'll come across it, is that the opposition, regardless of its inclinations, adopted, for example, the mourning rituals in Iran, which is that if somebody dies, you then have, and I think it's very similar to Judaism, you have you hold an event, a mourning event on the 7th day, and then you hold it on the 40th day. Now, what happened in later parts of the revolution is that people would go out into the streets, the army would shoot, people would die, then they would need to have a 7th. So on the 7th day, people would use that as an excuse to come out and to protest again. And then people would be shot at and then we would die. And therefore, you then had the next 7th, but you also had the 40th of the same group. And Charles Kurzman, who's a sociologist, has called that doing the 40-40. And this is just one example of the ways in which you adopt what is essentially a religious ritual into a revolutionary act. The Iranian part of the question for many in the 60s and 70s was, is Iran going through a crisis of cultural identity based on the fact that it was going through a rapid modernization? And it's really, really important to remember that what came out of the revolution, the demands of the revolution, was never a return to tradition, but rather what the Iranians did, even those who were inclined towards a more religious identity and characteristic for this revolution, were looking at something new, something that people had not done before. The lines as a result between the left and the religious were blurred. So as I mentioned, you had Marxist Islamists. And yet throughout much of this, not all of it, but throughout much of it, the state kept seeing secular groups, mainly the communists and Marxists, as the main enemy. And it's important to remember all of this, of course, is happening in the context of the Cold War. And that is partly where that comes from. I just want to say one more word about this, which is that there were, again, it's not just the idea that there were Marxist-Leninists. The revolution happens because you can make revolutionary alliances past your ideology. And this alliance comes about in terms of a unity against the Shah, but also for ideas such as social justice. And I really, really like the picture on the top because it really gives you a really good sense. And these are some very famous and important people in the history of revolutions, actually in the 70s in Lebanon and Iran. But unfortunately, we want to make sure we have time. We don't want to run out of time. And we often forget, but it's really important to remember that the Iranian Revolution happens in February 11th, 1979. It's declared victorious. The Shah, as you can see here, leaves Iran never to come back on January 16th, 1979. So basically, a year before all of this happened, Jimmy Carter was in Tehran on New Year's Eve, celebrating what he says, is Iran, which is an island of stability in one of the most troubled regions of the world. And it's a very famous quote because, of course, a year later, the whole system collapsed onto itself. Let me stop here for a second and see if there are any questions.
Thank you. Good deal. We have a question that actually came in a little bit earlier. It's from Robert. And his question is about the Egyptian coup. But do you think that the Egyptian coup can be seen as a response to the Egyptian defeat in 1948-49 in the Israeli War of Independence? Do you see it as in similar to other times where defeated military turns on the government that lost the war? And Robert admits that he's trying to figure out how to situate and or view this Egyptian revolution. There's a question he had from earlier,
Yeah,
and I
no,
wanted
no,
to
that's
make sure I
great.
came into
Um,
it.
I think you and me both, Robert, are trying to figure out how to view this Egyptian revolution and a whole generation of Egyptians. That's a really, really good question. And the answer is, in a sense, both yes, but a yes that is not all encompassing, if that makes sense, right? So basically the experience of the free officers had been in fighting the wars, and as Nasser writes it, there was this whole controversy, there's this whole scandal that emerges of the defective weapons, in which they talk about the fact that they did not even have good weapons to fight in this war. But the reason I said yes, and also just a small and limited sense, is that from that the understanding is not, oh, we were defeated by the Israelis, let's overturn the monarchy so we can go back and defeat the Israelis. But rather, that becomes a window into talking about what is wrong with us, right? Why is the system corrupt? And the connection, and this is where the quote that Nasser said that I pulled from his writing is really important, because the idea is that we have been fighting for our independence for many decades, starting with Egypt for the Egyptians in Sohrabi and just moving forward. And I would say if there was one external enemy outside of, the monarchy that was important to them, it was the British, who had occupied the country, had never given independence. They had occupied it, then they had sort of left, but had talked about Egypt being a protectorate, and all of it came down to the Brits not wanting to give up the Suez Canal. And so you're right that it is connected to it, and they talk about it. So it is part of the discourse of it, but it becomes a way to talk about a much wider historical issue, and of course a political issue, which is the corruption of the state and the economic consequences of that corruption. What effects did the Iranian Revolution have on society back from 1979? Elva, what do you mean by that? If you put that in the chat, I will come back to that, if that's okay.
Yes, that's one of the questions that was in the chat. I will say it's 8 o'clock now. We have about 30 minutes remaining.
Yep.
And so we have, if you would like, I can hold on to those two questions until we finish up.
That sounds good.
If you would like to proceed.
Yeah.
We have two in the chat that are waiting. And to those who are entering the questions, thank you. We will be sure to thank you.
Yeah, I'm hoping we'll have a good amount of questions.
Yes, we should be fine.
Our famous last words, but it's gonna happen.
It's fine. We have plenty of time.
I hope in some ways this particular slide will help with Elva's question, because one of the issues that keeps coming up when we talk about the 79 revolution in Iran, as I mentioned, there were so many alliances and the multiplicity of thought contained in it. And its aftermath became so politicized that when we talk about the Iranian Revolution, we talk less about was it a revolution or not, and more about what is the nature of this revolution. And in a nutshell, basically, this is a question of is the answer to this question, is it cultural, right? So basically, the Iranian Revolution is an Islamist takeover of a secular monarchy, is one way. And that Iranians, and that's this argument goes, Iranians are Shi'i Muslims, the Shah was a secular figure, which actually historically, yes and no, but I'm going to put that in parentheses. And that the Iranians basically wanted to have an Islamic state, and that's why the revolution happened. And there is some grain of truth to that, but it's one of the weaker explanations. for why the Iranian Revolution happened. Another explanation, and this is about the fact that in some ways it was a third worldist revolution. And by third worldist, we're talking about the decolonization ideas that connects it to Algeria, it connects it to Oman, it talks it to much of the global south, which is revolution is primarily this anti-Western movement. And here it again connects to other revolutions that were happening in 1979. And in the Iranian case, you can make it more specific if you think back to the 1953 coup, that in some ways the revolution comes out of the memory of that coup in a world in which anti-Western thought, anti-colonial thought reigns supreme, particularly among the youth. And the last explanation that I'll just mention is that the Iranian Revolution is the idea of a revolution as a breakdown of social order through rapid modernization. This is much more of a structuralist explanation of the revolution, if you want to talk about, which is that, basically, there's a huge, as you all know, in the 1970s, oil prices go up. Iran is flush with money, and that the modernization plans that the Shah had, I think a more complicated explanation would be that these modernization plans to change society was happening very, very quickly. And people would add to that to say, along with these changes, there was no opening of the political space, right? So as you have this idea that the Shah had of what he called the Great Civilization, a world in which there would also be no illiteracy, in which people would have a higher standard of living, in that same era, he also creates a one-party state, and basically everybody had to join this one political party, which, as we all know from other parts of history, is a very it's meant to basically clamp down on dissent. So I would say one explanation for the Iranian Revolution is that you had rapid modernization without giving into the increasing demands for freedom of speech and other forms of opening in the political world. Now, it was mere coincidence, of course, that Hosni Mubarak stepped down after 3 decades of rule in Egypt on February 11th, the day of Iran's 1979 revolutionary victory. But for me, though, it was more than a coincidence. Watching what was happening in Egypt unfold in 2011 is what triggered my interest in finding a way to understand first the 1979 revolution in Iran, but also beyond that, a more experiential versus a political perspective of revolutions in general. Watching Egyptians call for the fall of the regime and then engage in post-revolutionary political, social, and cultural rebuilding, only for the army in the form of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's currently still the president, to come into power a bit more than 2 years later, got me thinking, what do people think when they engage in revolutionary struggles? And where do these feelings and experiences go once we historians tidy up the narrative? Egypt, of course, was part of the 2010-2011 Arab Spring revolutions, a series of uprisings that was connected to each other through the sense of empowerment that the initial series of success created through people in the region. The narrative now is that it all started when the Tunisian Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolated in December of 2010. He was a street vendor. He sold produce whose wares, his scales, had been confiscated by the police, and he had been harassed. And this was just part of, it was not his first time that this had happened to him. He was 26, and he just couldn't handle it anymore. And in public, he set himself on fire. That also sparked mass protests throughout Tunisia. And a month after he did that, in December of 2010, the Tunisian president stepped down. And this is, just to give you a sense of this slide, this is my students are all currently doing their final projects, and they're creating revolutionary pamphlets. And this is a revolutionary pamphlet that one of the groups created for the for not just the Jasmine Revolution, but for the Tunisian Revolution today. So Bouazizi's death set off mass protests in Tunisia that then spread to Egypt, to Bahrain, to Libya, and then shockingly, for those of us who had been watching the Middle East for many years, to Syria. In Syria, the spark that ignited the fire was the torture and mutilation of young boys by the security forces in the town of Daraa for writing graffiti on the wall. And it bears remembering that Daraa in Syria was already suffering, the whole region was economically, from a massive drought. And you can see on this is something that was created by The Guardian on several years ago. You can see the geographic spread of what we call the Arab Spring revolutions of this period. But as the slide from the same Guardian article on Arab revolutions show, the cost of the events set off in 2011 were high in every sense of the word. And as others have shown, on some level, there was little to gain. Even in the case of Tunisia, that was constantly touted as a success, and perhaps the only success of the Arab Spring, currently in this year, in 2022 and 2023, we see rollback of political gains, we see crackdowns on critics, spreading of xenophobia, and a new constitution that has actually expanded presidential powers. This, quote, failure of the Arab Spring revolutions has led to analyses that focus on a variety of things, but primarily on two things. One is that it focuses on the role of social media, and it has, as you can see on the right side of the screen, it has raised questions about leaderless revolutions and their limitations for success. And I put leaderless in quotes. These analyses are often set against a backdrop that compares these newer revolutions to older revolutions driven by ideology or ideas of national independence, and asks, can really a revolution that is happening where collective action is happening on social media and that are happening without any leader in sight actually succeed? But my students took a different lesson in their research when they were looking at this. And this again refers back to Tunisia. And what they understood, or the lessons that they took, and I swear I had nothing to do with it, is that they focused on the sense of empowerment that revolutions, failed or successful, create in people, and the ways in which it raises their sense of possibilities. And I couldn't say it better than my colleague Yusuf Eshezli, who in a piece called The Egyptian Revolution 10 Years On, it's on the Crown Center at Brandeis's website, you can find it, where he's talking about, this is 10 years after the Egyptian Revolution, but it can be expanded actually to many different revolutionary settings. And he says, I think that this past decade has been a watershed for politics in the region, similar to the post-independence moments in several Arab countries. It really has been a transformative event for populations. One of the big everyday legacies of the January 25th revolution, and this is the one in Egypt, is its function as a historical marker, separating a before and an after. I was recently in a new suburb of Alexandria with two Egyptians who were trying to figure out when a building was constructed. Although neither of them participated in the revolution, one viewed it slightly favorably and the other opposed it, the two discussed the building as being from either, quote, before or after the revolution. This anecdote merely suggests how, although there are debates surrounding the legacy, the event has fused with the lives of Egyptians and its impact is unlikely to fade. And I want to end on this. Lest it be thought that I'm a revolutionary, I want to say that I'm not. I'm actually a child of a revolution and of a post-revolutionary war. was raised in Iran in the 1980s, right after the revolution happened. But at the same time, I'm actually not invested in social science models. I'm interested in what people experience and what people see when they go out into the streets and how they experience the afterlife of the sentiments that brought them to the streets, the sentiments they felt at the time, and what happens afterwards. And I want to end on these two photographs and a note of what has happened recently in Iran. As some of you may know, in September of 2022, a young woman named Mahsa Amini was picked up on the streets of Tehran for improper veiling, and she died in police custody. That set off a whole series, an unprecedented number of protests that spread throughout throughout the country, and it continued for several months. Um, Thousands and thousands and thousands of people were arrested. Several people were executed by the state. Many of the people, including the two journalists who are associated in Iran with breaking the story, remain in prison. And the chatter all over social media and among various observers and among various Iranians was that this is a revolution, and things are going to, the government is going to fall, particularly the son of the Shah, who was deposed in 79, who lives in the United States. It became a boon for him and for others around him to say, okay, this is the end of the Islamic Republic. But people went home. There's no one in the streets. People are not out in the streets shouting slogans and putting their lives on the line. But one of the things that has happened is something that none of us could have ever imagined, is that more and more women in the streets of Iran today are walking around without a headscarf on. That would have been unimaginable several years ago or even a year ago. And I leave you with that question of what it means to talk about revolutions, what it means to assess revolutionary effects, and whether the effects of a revolution, whether the whole idea of success and failure hinges on what it does to people or what it does to political systems and states. And with that, I'm open to questions, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. We truly appreciate that. And we do have a question. Actually, Elva mentioned that the question that she had about what effects did the Iranian Revolution have on society back from 1979. In the audience chat, she mentioned that you had responded to that, and she says, thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Yes. And we have another question from Dan as well that was included in the audience chat. But the question is, it says, thinking about the ideas that inform revolutions, we may assume that ideologies circulate within elite discourses. However, within Iran in the 1960s and 1970s, revolutionary ideas were transmitted through vehicles that may be surprising to students today. Can Professor Sohrabi speak to the role of a particular children's book in inspiring people in Iran and why this matters in helping us today? Appreciate the preconditions and sources of inspiration in revolutionary societies. That question sounds very specific. And so I wanted to see if maybe you can weigh in on that one.
Dan, do you want to weigh in a bit more on this since you asked such a specific question? What do you think?
And Dan, you can feel free to include it in the audience chat, and I will read it out as well. But I have another question from Monica as well. Mm-hmm. That I can read out. And Monica, thank you for including that. But her question, and I'll read it out. It says, is there value in determining a single primary cause for a revolution? Revolutions are typically seen as democratic actions, or at the very least, collective actions, because they reflect the will of the people. That being the case, there will inevitably be people with different experiences / reasons for participating in a revolution. Would it make sense wouldn't it make sense to teach students that there are multiple and potentially conflicting causes for revolution simply because no people are a monolith? Wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Mhm,
That is absolutely the case. There, you can't have something that is as messy and contingent, as I mentioned, and vast as revolutions happen for a single reason. I would even go forward and say you can't have anything human that happens for a single primary cause. So you're absolutely right, Monica. And I really like the way you put it that the see when social I think you're talking about the way in which scholars and social scientists try to explain how revolutions come about. And to be fair, even there, the idea isn't that it's a single cause, but it's multiple causes. And when you, for example, talk about structural causes of a revolution, right, you're looking at, for example, what are the effects of a particular educational system or an economic system or social systems that then eventually feed into these revolutionary movements. But I like the way you put it because what you are also saying is that we bring in that element of these larger structural causes, let's say, or these larger economic causes, then translate into very different responses in the people who then make the decision to come out into the street. And that, as you put it, makes the reasons for revolutionary revolutions and revolutionary activity never a monolithic act. You can't say that. And I really like the word that you actually put there, and I would underline that word, which is what you put different reasons. I would even say sometimes conflicting reasons. That's you did it, that potentially conflicting causes, and that's really the case. And what I would say in this case, and add to what you said, is that I would always pay attention because it's really fascinating in the way in which these can play out generationally. Also, I translated a piece that was published by Jadaliya when this Iran protests were happening in spring. I translated from this mother who is roughly my age, so she's middle aged. She has these young daughters, and about this conflicting causes that Monica talks about, how it manifests itself in such different ways in this mother daughter relationship, and how each of them, their generational experiences, determines not just how they were seeing the protests that were happening, but how they determined what kind of action they wanted to take. Um, I want to just talk back to Dan's question, which is Daniel mentions this book called Little Black Fish. It was written in 1966, if I'm not mistaken, and it's an allegory. It's an allegory for being engaged, I would say, more than being revolutionary. Although the ending, and I'm not going to give it because you all are going to go read it. It does. It is in some ways a call for action, and it involves a little black fish, without giving too much away. It was an important text, but I wouldn't say it's just an important revolutionary text. It was again a very important text that came out of its time, um, and became almost a Rorschach test for those who wanted to see themselves as engaged, committed activists in that period. So I'm really glad that you raised this, Dan. It's a very good book for teachers in general because it's been translated to English, and it's very nice to teach with it.
Hmm. Okay, good deal. And David actually has a question that just popped up in the audience chat, and I'll read it out.
Mhm.
His point is, I appreciate your points about how we define "quote unquote" success when it comes to revolutions. Do you think there is a reasonable time after which it's appropriate for us to try to assess success or failure? Is it still "quote unquote" too soon with the Arab Spring? Has there been enough historical distance? And again, in quotes, historical distance.
David, thank you so much for this question because it allows me to talk about something I love mentioning when I talk to people about revolutions in general. So, especially because all of you are so you're deeply steeped in history and all and know about the French Revolution. I always like to tell people, so the French Revolution, the mother of all revolutions, happens in 1789. What is going on in France 10 years later, right? You have the Reign of Terror. What is going on a bunch of years later? You have an emperor. You don't have a democratic republic. You have an emperor. By what? By 1815, 1816, you have the restoration of the monarchy that the French Revolution had overthrown. You continue having a monarchy. And then, in the aftermath of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, what you have is again, you have basically a Napoleon come back into power, and you don't basically get the kind of democratic, free values revolution that we think about and we associate, and we keep saying, oh, revolutions lead to democracy if they're successful. Revolutions lead to democracy if they're successful. You don't get it for about 100 years after the French Revolution had happened. And it's really, really important to keep this in mind and ask ourselves how we think about time and how we think about the question of success and failure, as David put it in the context of time. No, people don't refer to the French Revolution as a failure, and we need to ask ourselves why. Why was it that when the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France in the early parts of the 19th century, nobody said the French Revolution had failed? But here, you have a series of events happen, and we're just like, well, okay, these are not revolutions. Why? Because they're failed revolutions. I don't know how much time we need. I honestly don't know. I don't think anybody knows. The thing about revolutions is that it's not a revolution until it's a revolution. And I think we don't know whether we're in the aftermath of a revolution until we're in the aftermath of a revolution. So I can't give a number for the time, but I think it's really, really important to keep this point in mind, which is that these things are living, they're constantly evolving, and they're constantly changing. And the other point I would make on this wonderful question is also to think about the fact that, people keep going into the streets, right? So when we talk about these failures, when we talk about nothing changes, everything stays the same, if that's the case, and Iran is a really good example, why do people keep going out into the streets? Why do people keep putting their life and livelihood on the line? There has to be something in there, and I think the model of success and failure just doesn't do the experience of it justice. Thank you all for these wonderful questions. So I think, do we have time for one more?
We do. I see Robert's question there. I think you may see it there in the Q&A. I'll read it out loud for you. Thank you, Robert. Whenever I talk about the Iranian Revolution, I always talk about the Iran-Iraq War. Do you think there is a way that I can teach it without mentioning and going into the war?
First, I want to say, Robert, wow, you're my hero. That's more people should be talking about the bloodiest conventional war of the 20th century. So thank you for doing that. There is a way to talk about it. I don't know why you would want to, but I do. And the way is to say, and this is what I say to my students, is that, what we are talking about is we want to, and this goes back to the previous point, we want to detach the aftermath of a revolution at this point from the revolution itself. And the reason is that the question we're interested in is the process. It's revolutionary activity, revolutionary thought, right? And when we bring in the aftermath of a revolution into our analysis of a revolution itself, we are basically, no matter how hard we try, we can't get away from this teleology. So that because we know what happened after the revolution, because we know that there was an Islamic Republic that was established after 1979, because we know there was a war, we are then, because we're human, going to look into the 1960s and 70s. with that knowledge. But what if, as an exercise, we took away that forethought that we have, the hindsight that we have, and said, let's understand this historical moment as it unfurled for the people who were in its midst. And that's how I justify why I don't talk about the Iran-Iraq War, but rather talk about it in the context of post-revolutionary state building instead of the Iranian Revolution itself. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, everyone else, and most of all, Dr. Sohrabi. Just thank you so much for your passion for this work, which came through, and you're so personable. And I will tell you, as a moderator, I really enjoy when our presenters are interacting with the chat, actively reading and responding to the participants. That does not happen very often, so we truly appreciate you. And again, I'll echo what Daniel is saying. He has said thank you, and he says that you continue to inspire us all. So
thank you so much, and I meant it. It's been such an honor. I really thank you for inviting me. Thank you for staying on this journey with me. You guys are all so important to all of us, so thank you.
Well, we appreciate that, and I'll echo the sentiments. There was someone, I believe it was Monica or someone, who said that we need a part 2. So we will be in conversation with you about that. Again,
I'd love
everyone. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, spending your evening with us. This evening, I encourage you all to continue to keep up with what's happening at the National Humanities Center through our various social media feeds to get updates on our activities. I also invite you to check out our final webinar for the 22-23 season. That will be this Thursday, May 4th at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The topic is Difference and Diversity in the History of Computing. We have NH Fellow 2019, Mar Hicks, who is an Associate Professor of History, Technology at the Humanities Department at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And I frequently say how much I am so appreciative of you all, and I consider myself fortunate to be able to spend these evenings with you. While I see your names in the audience chat, I feel like I know you. I feel like I've had an opportunity to connect with you, and I look forward to doing the same in the coming year with you all. So if I can ever be of assistance to you, please do not hesitate to email or reach out to me. I am Mike Williams. I am at mwilliams@nationalhumanitycenter.org. Just know that you're valued, you're appreciated, and I hope that you will continue to have a great week. Thank you so much, and we will see you Thursday. Take care and be well.